Can you believe that an empire so vast, so incredibly powerful, that it controlled 45% of the entire global population, simply vanished? This wasn't just a kingdom. This was the original superpower, the unseen hand that dictated the fate of every civilization from the Mediterranean beaches to the Himalayan mountains. Yet somehow, history books often treat it like a footnote before the glory of Greece and Rome. That is a catastrophe no one saw coming, a criminal oversight we must now correct. We are about to plunge into the silent, terrifying secret of ancient Persia, the story they didn't want you to know. The true architects of world order who invented infrastructure, bureaucracy, and even religious tolerance centuries before anyone else dared to dream of such things. Prepare to witness the birth of a colossal civilization that emerged not from fertile river valleys, but from the brutal, desolate highlands, forging an identity sharper than any bronze spear. Forget everything you thought you knew about these legendary antagonists. They weren't merely the endless tide Xerxes threw against the 300 Spartans. They were the complex, magnificent masters of a domain stretching farther than modern America, controlling riches that would make the richest kings of Europe look like beggars. We are talking about the Achaemenid Dynasty, the very first Persian empire, a phenomenon that exploded onto the world stage like a supernova in the 6th century BC. Imagine this. For centuries, while Egypt perfected its tombs and Babylon practiced its arcane arts, the Iranian plateau was a fractured mosaic of nomadic tribes, tough, horse-riding warriors known collectively as the Aryans, a term that simply meant noble or civilized in their ancient tongue. They were small-scale bandits and farmers, constantly under the thumb of the mighty empires surrounding them, specifically the brutal, terrifying Assyrians, who ruled Mesopotamia with an iron fist soaked in blood. The Assyrians were the true monsters of this age, masters of psychological warfare, known for their mass deportations and spectacular cruelty. They were the regional bully, and the Persian tribes, led by chieftains like Tispes, constantly paid tribute just to survive another day. But paying tribute breeds resentment, and that slow, burning rage was the secret fuel for the empire's inevitable rise. The first real stirrings of revolution, the true beginning of this epic, comes through the Medes. While the Persians were clients, the Medes, based further north, managed to unite and, in a shocking display of power, allied with Babylon to sack the seemingly invincible Assyrian capital of Nineveh in 612 BC. This single act was the earthquake that shook the ancient world, proving that the established order could, in fact, crumble. But the Medes, under their king Astyages, soon grew complacent, falling into the same trap of luxury and tyranny that had doomed the Assyrians. They had the power, but they lacked the vision. Meanwhile, down in the subsidiary kingdom of Anshan, among the Persians, a new leader was rapidly coming of age, a man whose sheer strategic genius would utterly redefine warfare and governance. This man was Cyrus, later known to history as Cyrus the Great. Cyrus was not some firebrand revolutionary. He was a master manipulator, learning the weaknesses of the Median court while seemingly remaining a loyal vassal. The tension between the Medes and the Persians was a razor wire stretched across the region, ready to snap. Cyrus knew that brute force was not the answer. He needed legitimacy, and he needed a perfect opportunity. That opportunity arose when King Astyages, arrogant and fearful of his rising subordinate, ordered Cyrus to be brought to him. The story, heavily mythologized by Greek sources like Herodotus, claims Astyages had a terrifying dream, a dream where Cyrus's lineage would overthrow his own. Whether prophecy or paranoia, Astyages' mistake was underestimating the loyalty Cyrus commanded among his own people. In 550 BC, the inevitable happened. Cyrus raised the banner of revolt, and unlike many rebellions which are crushed swiftly, this one had massive popular support. The Median army, tired of Astyages' decadence, defected in mass to Cyrus's side. It was a bloodless coup, a transfer of power so smooth and decisive it was almost unbelievable. Cyrus did not destroy the Medes. He absorbed them, marrying their strengths to Persian ambition, creating the first truly unified Irani state. This act of mercy and integration, rather than destruction, was Cyrus's signature genius, a revolutionary political tactic that the world had never seen. He realized that a vast empire could only be maintained through respect, not just terror. He was not merely a conqueror, he was a political engineer. But the world did not stand still to admire his statesmanship. The sudden appearance of this unified Persian-Median power sent immediate shockwaves through the established centers of power. The kings of Lydia, Babylon, and even Egypt looked upon this new Eastern giant with naked fear and mistrust. They knew, instinctively, that the game had just changed forever. The most immediate threat came from the west, the kingdom of Lydia, ruled by the legendary Croesus, a man whose wealth was so immense that, rich as Croesus, became synonymous with unimaginable fortune. Croesus decided to strike first, believing that attack was the best defense against this upstart Persian king. He consulted the oracle of Delphi, who gave him a terrifyingly ambiguous prophecy. If Croesus marched against the Persians, a great empire would fall. Croesus, blinded by his own hubris, assumed the oracle meant the Persian Empire. He mobilized his legendary cavalry and marched east. The resulting conflict was lightning fast and utterly devastating. Cyrus met Croesus in battle, first at the Pteria, where the result was inconclusive, and then, after Croesus retreated to muster his full strength, Cyrus pursued him relentlessly, refusing to give him the winter break he desperately needed. The final fatal confrontation took place at Sardis. The Lydian cavalry was legendary, but Cyrus had a secret weapon, one that sounds almost comical, but proved devastatingly effective: camels. The Persians positioned their smelly, bizarre camels at the front line. The Lydian horses, never having encountered camels, were terrified by the strange sight and smell, refusing to charge or even hold formation. The entire Lydian army dissolved into chaos. Cyrus was now poised to challenge the greatest city on earth, the jewel of Mesopotamia, the legendary city of Babylon itself. And the way he took it? It wasn't through a bloody siege, but through an act of engineering so audacious, so utterly unthinkable, that it cemented his legend as the ultimate master of war and political theater. The story of how he diverted a river to walk into the city gates is not myth. It's history, and it's where the greatest age of conquest truly begins.
The Great Silence. That's what fell over Babylon when the Euphrates finally ran dry. The mightiest metropolis on earth, the city whose walls laughed at armies, suddenly found its foundations exposed to the Persian boot. The anticipation of bloodshed, the expected firestorm that should have followed such an unprecedented breach, was palpable, thick as the dust that coated the dried riverbed.
But Cyrus the Great was not Xerxes yet. He was not Alexander. He was something entirely new. A conqueror who understood that true power was not measured in corpses, but in consensus. He walked into the gates of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, not with a sword dripping venom, but with an open hand, a gesture that changed the very DNA of conquest forever. The citizens, huddled in fear, expected the standard operating procedure of history: mass enslavement, the destruction of temples, the annihilation of identity. What they got instead was the Cyrus cylinder, a small, baked clay barrel that holds the echoes of the future, a document more revolutionary than any fortress.
He didn't just permit them to live. He actively ordered the restoration of their gods and their shrines. He returned the sacred statues stolen by Nebuchadnezzar decades earlier. He gave the exiled Jewish population the decree, the unbelievable, world-shaking decree, to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their sacred Second Temple. This wasn't merely kindness. This was geopolitical genius, the recognition that a happy satellite state is a cheap satellite state, and that loyalty forged through respect is unbreakable steel.
This was the Achaemenid Charter: tolerance, infrastructure, and an almost terrifying efficiency. The empire was designed to be vast, but its arteries, the legendary Royal Road, had to pump lifeblood across the continents at breakneck speed. The very concept of the Shahanshah, the King of Kings, was born here, a ruler who governed over a mosaic of peoples, respecting their laws and their gods, asking only for their obedience and their tribute. From Sardis to Susa, the road was a network of relay stations, allowing royal messengers to traverse 1,677 miles in barely 7 days. Imagine the shockwave of information traveling faster than anyone in the recorded world had ever witnessed. This wasn't just governance. This was the creation of a unified global system, administered by the first true global bureaucracy. A system so perfectly tuned that Rome would attempt to replicate it centuries later and still fall short. Cambyses was not the diplomat his father was. He was the intense, volatile inheritor, haunted by the shadow of a legendary predecessor and desperate to finish the map, desperate to prove that the empire was not a fluke of one man's genius. He required a defining conquest, a victory so monumental it would silence every whisper of doubt. There was one final, glittering jewel remaining, a civilization whose history stretched back millennia, before the Medes had even learned to write. Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, the last bastion of true sovereign ancient power, stood defiant against the rising sun of Persia. Cambyses knew that the Achaemenid Empire could not be complete until the Nile flowed beneath his authority. The sheer audacity of the Egyptian campaign cannot be overstated. It required moving a massive army across the unforgiving, bone-dry Sinai Peninsula, a feat of logistics that rivals any modern military operation. Cambyses, however, had the ultimate weapon: betrayal, leveraging the fury of Phanes of Halicarnassus. Phanes, a brilliant Greek mercenary commander who had defected from Egypt, carried with him the detailed battle plans, supply routes, and weaknesses of Pharaoh Psamtik III. Phanes didn't just give Cambyses information, he gave him the psychological playbook for dismantling the Egyptian defenses before the first arrow flew. The confrontation came at Pelusium in 525 BCE, a clash between the ancient, symbolic power of the pharaohs and the brutal, modern efficiency of the Achaemenids. The story that Cambyses deployed cats and other animals sacred to the Egyptians as shields, forcing the Egyptians to surrender rather than harm their gods, is perhaps exaggerated by Greek chroniclers, desperate to paint the Persians as clever barbarians. But the strategic truth remains. The Egyptians faltered. They were psychologically broken before the battle was truly decided. The loss was devastating. The entire Egyptian line shattered, and Psamtik III retreated desperately to Memphis. Memphis, the ancient capital, fell shortly thereafter. The pharaoh himself was captured. The initial phase of conquest mirrored Cyrus's policy. Cambyses adopted the titles of the pharaoh, paid homage to Neith, and maintained the appearance of respecting the cosmic order of Ma'at. The greatest empire the world had ever seen now stretched from the Indus River to the Nile Delta, securing the vital grain supply of Africa and the rich trade routes of the Mediterranean. Cambyses had achieved the impossible, unifying the civilized world under a single terrifying banner. The map was finished. The cost, however, was about to be paid, not in gold, but in blood and revolt, starting with a mysterious figure rising in media, claiming to be the dead brother of the king, igniting a civil war that would shake the very foundations of the King of Kings. The desert wind carried more than sand. It carried a whisper that ripped the crown from the King of Kings. While Cambyses II, son of the legendary Cyrus, was wrestling with the cursed mysteries of the Nile, a terror unlike any other had seized his homeland. The message was delivered by a breathless runner, a man who had ridden his horse into the ground. His younger brother, Bardia, Smerdis, the one Cambyses had secretly murdered years prior to secure his throne, was alive. He was not just alive. He was sitting on the throne in Media, issuing decrees of clemency and tax relief, winning the hearts of the Median and Persian nobility, claiming the title of the Great King. It was a phantom revolt, fueled by a terrifying secret that Cambyses thought he had buried forever in the silent halls of Pasargadae. The sheer audacity of the claim paralyzed the conqueror of Egypt, whose grip on sanity was already fraying. But the identity of the usurper was a dagger twisted deep into the heart of the empire. This was no miraculous resurrection. This was Gaumata, the Magian, a priest whose physical similarity to the true Smerdis was so profound, so terrifyingly exact, that even those who knew the royal family were fooled. He was a master manipulator who had seized the moment of imperial weakness, leveraging the populace's exhaustion with Cambyses' increasingly erratic rule and his endless foreign wars. Gaumata's genius lay in his simplicity. He immediately canceled 3 years of tribute, effectively buying the loyalty of vast swaths of the population, establishing a power base that solidified faster than a desert flash flood. Cambyses knew instantly that if this impostor lived, the secret of Smerdis' murder would be exposed, shattering the divine mandate of the Achaemenid line and proving that the great dynasty of Cyrus was founded on fratricide. Enraged, half mad with paranoia, Cambyses abandoned his Egyptian conquest, beginning the long, desperate march home across the unforgiving Levant, racing against a ghost. He was racing against a political illusion, threatening to swallow his birthright whole. He knew he had to crush the lie, even if it meant admitting his own crime to the gathered satraps. But fate, history's most vicious playwright, intervened with sudden, shocking brutality, ensuring the King of Kings would never see his capital again. Accounts vary, spun by victors and whispered by the defeated. But the result was indisputable. While mounting his horse near a town in Syria, or perhaps in agonizing despair while addressing his troops, Cambyses II suffered a fatal wound. A terrible accident, the official history claimed. His own dagger accidentally pierced his thigh in the exact same spot where he had fatally wounded the sacred Apis bull months earlier, a chilling echo of divine vengeance against a blasphemer. Others say, and the whispers carry weight even today, that upon realizing the unstoppable power of Gaumata's deception and the impossibility of restoring order, the King of Kings took his own life, choosing a swift, agonizing death over the slow, agonizing humiliation of defeat. In 522 BCE, the second great Achaemenid emperor lay dead. His reign ended not by a glorious battle, but by a sudden, pathetic demise on a dusty roadside, leaving the largest empire the world had ever known leaderless, reeling under the spell of a fraudulent priest. The Magian now reigned supreme, cloaked in the stolen identity of Smerdis, protected by the very lie that had killed his predecessor.
Gaumata ruled for 7 terrifying months, an interregnum, where the foundations of the Persian elite began to crack and crumble.
He was a priest-king, elevating the authority of the Median Magian class, sidelining the proud Persian warrior aristocracy that had built the empire through blood and iron. He destroyed temples dedicated to the ancient Persian gods and retreated into his fortress, refusing to show his face to anyone except his most trusted inner circle, fueling suspicion that his identity was fragile and his power predicated entirely on isolation.
The royal court, the powerful houses of Persia, watched in horror, their fate hanging by a thread. They knew the true Smerdes was dead. They understood that if this Magian was allowed to solidify his grip, the Achaemenid dynasty, founded by the divine guidance of Ahura Mazda, would be utterly extinguished, replaced by a Median religious tyranny that despised the very essence of Persian rule. Out of this darkness, a new force began to coalesce, meeting in the dead of night, speaking in guarded whispers lest the walls themselves betray them. This was the moment for Darius, son of Hystaspes, a man of exceptional ambition, a fierce warrior, and a distant cousin to the fallen Cambyses, who had served as his spear-bearer in Egypt. Darius, a member of the elite Persian guard, whose bloodline traced back to the original ruling houses, was ready to gamble everything. He convinced 6 other high-ranking Persian nobles, men whose names would be etched forever into the history of high-stakes political violence, that action had to be taken immediately. This cabal, the famed 7 conspirators, formed a pact forged in sheer terror and ruthless ambition, knowing that failure meant not just their own execution, but the total annihilation of their ancient Persian identity and the legacy of Cyrus. The plan was suicidal in its audacity: infiltrate the fortress where Gaumata hid, strike fast, and execute the usurper before he could rally his growing Median support and cement his rule permanently. Every shadow was an informant, every servant a potential spy. Every breath taken was a risk of betrayal. They were moving in a world where one wrong look, one misplaced word, could lead to an agonizing, prolonged execution. The day finally arrived, a day that would determine whether the Achaemenid Empire lived or died. The 7 rode toward the fortress of Sikeovati, their hearts pounding not just with fear, but with the terrifying urgency of national destiny. They faced a double challenge: overcoming the legions of Magian guards loyal to the usurper, and, more critically, overcoming the magical aura surrounding the priest-king who wore the face of a dead prince. Darius, the youngest but the most decisive, took the lead, his gaze fixed on the fortress walls, knowing the immense scale of the risk. He knew the world was watching, even if it didn't know it yet. If they failed, the vast, silent empire of the Persians would vanish, swallowed by the sands of time and the calculated deceit of a clever Magian. The tension was unbearable, the silence of the march broken only by the rhythmic clang of their concealed weaponry and the muffled drumming of their horses' hooves. This wasn't just a regicide. This was the brutal, bloody birth of a new era,
secured by the sharp edge of a Persian sword. This secret assassination, this single act of unparalleled risk, would either save the empire or plunge it into a century of immediate, devastating civil war. The entire legacy of Cyrus the Great, the glory of the first true global empire, rested precariously on the shoulders of 7 desperate men, gambling everything on a single desperate thrust into the heart of the usurper's lair. The desert wind was the only mourner for Cambyses, dead by accident, suicide, or the chilling whisper of a secret wound, leaving no direct heir but a continent-sized void of power where the son of Cyrus once stood. The bloodline that was supposed to secure the world's peace forever had snapped with a terrifying finality, and history held its breath, waiting for the inevitable collapse of the newly forged global order. Out of the shadows of the Median priesthood, the ultimate political parasite emerged, a man named Gaumata, a magus, who wore the chillingly perfect mask of the dead Prince Bardia and claimed the imperial throne of the world. The lie was not merely political, it was colossal, built on the silence of the grave and the terrible terror of the unknown. Cambyses, in a fit of paranoia or necessary precaution, had secretly murdered his brother Bardia before marching into Egypt, meaning no living soul outside the royal entourage could contradict the impostor.
Gaumata, operating from a secluded fortress, immediately began a campaign of populist genius, canceling taxes for 3 long years and granting immediate freedom from military service, cementing his popularity while consolidating the vast wealth of the imperial treasury in his Median stronghold.
Persia, the very heart of the Achaemenid ideal, was under the complete sway of a phantom king, a sorcerer using the divine authority of Ahura Mazda for his own deeply terrifying and self-serving ends. He was a Median wolf in Persian clothing, threatening to reverse the course of history and plunge the empire back into obscurity. But the noble families, those 7 ancient houses whose roots extended deeper than even Cyrus's own immediate dynasty, refused to let the dream die to a cheap trick of costume and deception. They knew the terrible truth. They understood that if this charlatan reigned, the pure Persian lineage and the very structure of the empire would be extinguished forever, replaced by the sinister power of the Magian cult. 7 names began to be whispered in the dark corners of the royal court, driven by a cold, unifying fury that transcended mere ambition. Darius, son of Hystaspes, a distant but legitimate Achaemenid cousin who saw the sacred mandate of heaven slipping away, and 6 others, the representatives of the most powerful founding clans. These men were not career assassins. They were politicians, strategists, and inheritors of the Median tradition of king-making, now forced by the extreme circumstances to become executioners in the dead of night, knowing failure meant immediate, excruciating death for themselves and their entire families.
Their approach to the fortress Sikayalvati was a scene ripped straight from the highest tragedy. 7 ghosts slipping past guards who were sworn to protect the very lie they intended to murder, gambling the entire future of civilization on a knife blade and a prayer. The air inside the inner sanctuary was thick with the suffocating incense of Magian ritual, the false king surrounded by his most loyal guards, utterly unaware that the true masters of Persia were closing in. The moment the 7 conspirators breached the inner chambers, the subsequent battle was not for the superficial trappings of the throne, but for the very soul of the empire. A desperate, brutal brawl against the Magus and his terrified supporters in the flickering torchlight.
The silence that followed the death of Gaumata lasted only an instant before turning into a terrible, bloodthirsty roar across the capital. The common people, horrified by the scale of the deception, hunted down every magus they could find in a day of terrible vengeance, known forever as the Megaphonia.
But the death of the pretender did not bring the expected peace. It only unleashed the kraken that Cambyses' death had summoned. The moment the imperial structure showed a crack, the vulnerability of the Achaemenid line, every single conquered nation seized the opportunity to tear itself violently free from the Persian yoke.
Elam revolted, seeking to reclaim its ancient independence. Babylon rose up under the terrifying banner of another pretender, Nebuchadnezzar IV. Media, the source of the recent deception, sought fiercely to seize independence and perhaps even the empire itself. The crisis facing Darius was total, immediate, and utterly overwhelming, threatening to shred the map of the world. Darius, thrust onto a throne still soaked in the blood of civil war and doubt, faced the impossible, putting down 19 major documented rebellions across 18 distinct territories in less than 2 years of ceaseless, savage campaigning. The man who had been a shadowy conspirator now had to transform himself overnight into the greatest military and logistical genius the world had yet encountered, fighting simultaneously on multiple fronts that stretched from the borders of Egypt to the remote mountainous territories of Bactria. Every single victory, every reclaimed province, every executed rebel leader was painstakingly etched into the towering mountain face at Behistun, not merely as a historical record, but as a divine decree, proof absolute that Darius was chosen by Ahura Mazda to restore order to a world teetering violently on the edge of oblivion.
This was the terrifying fragility of the Achaemenid model, an empire so vast, so diverse, that it could only be held together by the divine, unquestioned authority of its ruler, the King of Kings. When that authority fractured, the entire world shook in response.
Darius I, the ultimate restorer and consolidator, had saved the empire. Darius I, the ultimate restorer and consolidator, had saved the empire from internal annihilation. But the deep, ragged scar of that great civil war would forever remind the Persians that the global domination achieved by the benevolent genius of Cyrus
was just one desperate, bloody conspiracy away from utter ruin. The stage was now set for the true, magnificent glory of the Achaemenid dynasty, the peak of its power and infrastructure. But that glory was forged in the fire of betrayal, secured only by the absolute iron fist of the man who had murdered a lie to become a king.
The dust had settled, but the ground was still shaking violently beneath the sandals of the new King of Kings. Darius, the man who claimed the throne through a mixture of assassination, divine mandate, and perhaps the most complex political theater in human history, was facing a reality far uglier than any court intrigue. When he took control, the Achaemenid world wasn't a unified empire. It was 1,000 desperate city-states watching for the moment to break free, a collection of simmering provincial resentments ready to boil over into full-scale revolution against the Persian core.
He spent the first 2 years of his reign not building monuments, but waging war against his own domain. 9 separate kings rose up simultaneously in different corners of the realm: Babylon, Media, Elam, even the sacred lands of Persia itself, each claiming the mantle of legitimacy, each ready to tear the legacy of Cyrus apart. Darius's campaigns were brutal, relentless, and absolute, an 18-month hammer striking every single rebellious nail into the hard earth. This was not the clemency of Cyrus. This was the unforgiving judgment required to stop a global empire from committing suicide. The world needed to know who was in charge, and Darius chose the most permanent way imaginable to deliver his message. He carved it into a mountain face, high above the plains where all trade routes converged. This was the Behestim. Imagine the sheer audacity of this move. He didn't just write a scroll or erect a stele in a capital city. He commanded his scribes and engineers to climb 300 feet up a sheer cliff overlooking the ancient road connecting Mesopotamia and Media. And there he had the entire history of the coup, his divine right, and the fate of every rebel chiseled into the rock. It was written in 3 languages: Old Persian for his own people, Elamite for the bureaucrats, and Babylonian for the vast populations of Mesopotamia, ensuring that no one, from the highest official to the lowest mule driver, could mistake the truth as defined by the King of Kings. This monument was not history, it was propaganda carved by the hand of Ahura Mazda himself, declaring that the man who had been murdered was Smyrdes, the legitimate prince, and the man who ruled was Darius, placed there by the supreme benevolent deity to restore order. With his legitimacy literally etched into the landscape, Darius could finally pivot from brute force to revolutionary organization. He understood that controlling an empire that spanned 3 continents required more than just the terror of the immortals. It required structure, taxation, and communication, systems that would make the very notion of rebellion economically and logistically unthinkable. This is where Darius earns the title the Great in the eyes of history, even if his methods were terrifyingly efficient. He took the sprawling, loosely managed territories left by Cyrus and Cambyses,
and systematically carved them into 20 distinct satrapies, or provinces. Each satrapy was a miniature kingdom, vast in size and wealth, but one kept on an impossibly short, golden leash.
To prevent any single satrap from gaining too much power, the very danger that had nearly cost him the throne, Darius established a brilliant, terrifying system of checks and balances. Each province had 3 distinct, non-communicating branches of power. There was the satrap himself, who handled civil administration and collected taxes, a wealthy but increasingly vulnerable target. Then there was the military commander, appointed directly by the king, who controlled the garrisons and answered only to Susa, standing ready to execute the satrap at a moment's notice. And finally, there was the silent, watchful eye of the king, the royal secretary, or more dramatically, the eye of the king, a trusted spy network moving constantly between the capitals and the provinces, reporting directly back to the central palace. This meant the satrap could not control the army, and the army commander could not touch the administration or the tax revenues. If any one of them showed too much ambition, the eye of the king would see it, and the response would be swift, absolute, and usually fatal. This institutionalized paranoia was the crucial, unbreakable glue that held the Achaemenid dynasty together for 2 centuries, forging an empire that could finally endure. But an empire this large needed to move faster than the speed of a messenger on horseback. Darius created the world's first true superhighway system, the Royal Road. It stretched 1,600 miles from Susa, the administrative capital, all the way to Sardis in Lydia, deep into modern Turkey, connecting the Aegean Sea to the Persian heartland. It wasn't just a path. It was a purpose-built, paved logistical miracle that changed the speed of history. Along this meticulously maintained route, the king established standardized staging posts every few miles, complete with fresh horses, food, and accommodation. Herodotus famously marveled at this system, noting that these couriers were stopped by neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night. This incredible postal system ensured that a critical message could travel the entire length of the empire in about 7 days, a journey that would take a normal traveler 3 months. This instant communication bound the colossal empire together, making the distant provinces feel shockingly close to the iron fist reigning in Persia, ensuring that even the most remote satrap knew the king's will within the week. And to tie it all together, the final masterstroke of Darius's consolidation, he introduced standardized coinage. Before Darius, trade was a complicated mess of barter and inconsistent weight systems, creating chaos in the marketplace. Darius introduced the daric, a magnificent gold coin of standardized purity, stamped with the image of the king himself as an archer, eternally ready to strike. This coin didn't just simplify trade, it unified the entire economy, ensuring that taxes could be collected consistently and that the massive bureaucracy could be paid reliably in one universal tender. Crucially, every soldier, every administrator, and every merchant knew exactly whose authority they were operating under. When you paid your taxes, or when you purchased grain in Egypt or India, the heavy gold in your hand bore the indelible, powerful mark of Darius. The age of Darius was the moment the Achaemenid Empire stopped being merely a conquest and started being a civilization, built on the terrifying efficiency of a man who murdered a lie and then spent the rest of his life ensuring that his truth was the only one that mattered, etched in stone and stamped in gold. The stage was set, the infrastructure perfected, the armies restless. Now the great beast of Persia had to look outward, past its newly secured borders, to satisfy its terrifying, insatiable hunger for global supremacy. The mantle of world domination, heavy and stained with the blood of nations, fell not to the wise administrator, but to the ruthless conqueror. Cyrus the Great had built the house, but it was his son, Cambyses II, who now held the terrifying keys, and he wasted no time turning the quiet empire into a screaming engine of war. The insatiable hunger mentioned before was not a metaphor. It was a military directive etched in bronze. Cyrus had secured the foundation, but the true global empire, the one that would truly define Achaemenid dominance, required swallowing the only remaining great civilization that stood against them, Egypt, the ancient titan of the Nile. Cambyses inherited a perfect machine. The supply lines were established, the cavalry units were the finest the world had ever known, and the sheer scale of the Persian war machine dwarfed anything Pharaoh Psamtik III could muster. But Egypt was not Babylon. It was a monolithic entity, a fortress defended not just by its formidable army and massive coastal defenses, but by the relentless, soul-crushing expanse of the Sinai Desert. To challenge Egypt was to challenge time itself, to attempt an invasion across a crucible of sand and thirst, where entire armies historically evaporated into ghosts. Cambyses understood this brutal truth. The desert was the primary enemy, fiercer than any Egyptian chariot division. He did not rely solely on the massive Persian supply chains, which stretched hundreds of miles. Instead, he forged a pact that changed the entire fate of the campaign. He leveraged the power of the sheiks of Arabia, specifically the king of the Kedarite Arabs. These masters of the desolate wastes agreed to ferry water, essential supplies, and expert guides across the treacherous, lifeless Sinai Peninsula, effectively neutralizing Egypt's greatest defense. This agreement was the silent, deadly pivot point of the war. Imagine the spectacle. 250,000 Persian and allied soldiers marching toward the Nile Delta, protected not primarily by steel, but by a meticulously orchestrated network of water skins and camel routes. Pharaoh Psamtik III, blindsided by the speed and logistical brilliance of the advance, had relied on the Sinai as his eternal, impermeable shield. His last desperate hope lay in his powerful mercenary forces, particularly the experienced Greek and Carian soldiers, who formed the disciplined backbone of the Egyptian defense at the strategic gateway city of Pelusium. The confrontation exploded at Pelusium in 525 BCE, turning the eastern Nile Delta
into a slaughterhouse. The accounts of this battle are steeped in YouTube-worthy drama, particularly the infamous legend involving the sacred animals, a psychological warfare campaign so brilliant it chills the blood. The story, perhaps exaggerated but undeniably compelling, claims Cambyses deployed the ultimate cultural weapon against the spiritually sensitive Egyptians. Egyptians revered the goddess Bastet, often depicted as a cat or lioness, and harming these animals was a capital offense, a sacrilege punishable by death regardless of context. According to Herodotus, Cambyses ordered his front lines to carry these sacred creatures, or perhaps images of them, strapped to their shields, effectively paralyzing the Egyptian lines.
Soldiers who would willingly charge into a storm of arrows hesitated, unable to fire a bow or swing a sword for fear of accidentally striking a divine creature. Whether this tale is literal truth or brilliant propaganda designed to terrify, the psychological pressure was catastrophic. The Egyptian forces broke, routed by a combination of superior Persian cavalry and spiritual terror. Psamtik III retreated to Memphis, the ancient capital, but the siege was swift and merciless. Egypt fell. The Achaemenid Empire, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, now included the monumental wealth, the sophisticated bureaucracy, and the staggering history of the Nile Valley. Cambyses, mirroring his father's shrewd political strategy in Babylon, did not immediately resort to annihilation. He was crowned pharaoh, adopting the titles and regalia of the ancient Egyptian kings, a display of assimilation designed to legitimize his rule in the eyes of the priests and the people. But this is where the narrative darkens, twisting away from Cyrus's path of clemency and plunging into a realm of terrifying instability. Cambyses' reign quickly devolved into a nightmare, according to the Greek sources who loved to paint Persian kings as unstable, capricious tyrants. After his initial gestures of respect, his behavior grew erratic. Whispers started. Whispers of sacrilege, of disturbing ancient tombs, of mocking the Egyptian gods, and eventually of paranoia and murder within his own family. He was a long way from the diplomatic genius of his father. Was this genuine madness, perhaps fueled by the intense pressures of ruling the largest empire the world had yet seen? Or was it simply the bitter propaganda of a conquered people and their Greek allies, eager to justify their hatred? The stories crescendoed into shocking acts. He allegedly ordered the sacred Apis bull, the living embodiment of the god Ptah, to be publicly scourged and killed, a move designed to tear at the spiritual heart of Egypt and challenge the priest's power directly. The details are messy, terrifying, and deeply confusing, but the immediate result was clear. The stability built by Cyrus was beginning to crack under the weight of Cambyses' instability. Cambyses, distracted by disastrous expansion into North Africa, including the legendary lost army that vanished into the desert sands, and increasingly consumed by his own erratic behavior, was eventually forced to return home. A sudden, terrifying crisis had erupted in the Persian heartland, a political firestorm orchestrated by a usurper who claimed to be Cambyses' murdered brother,
Smyrdes, Cambyses, racing back to reclaim his throne and save the empire, met a sudden, violent, and mysterious end on the road. The great king was dead, and the empire, barely 30 years old, faced its first colossal, existential crisis.
The stage was now set for the most cunning, most efficient, and perhaps the most ruthless ruler Persia would ever produce to seize power: Darius the Great.
Darius the Great did not inherit a golden throne. He seized a molten crown surrounded by wildfire. Within months of taking control, the vast, fragile edifice of the Achaemenid Empire erupted into a cacophony of rebellion, a massive, terrifying backlash against the regicide that had placed him on the purple.
19 different regions, 9 major power centers, including the crucial ancient satrapies of Babylon and Media, simultaneously declared independence or backed rival claimants who materialized from the shadows, each one whispering that they were the rightful heir of Cyrus. This wasn't just border skirmishes. This was total systemic failure, a full-scale civil war threatening to undo generations of conquest, forcing Darius to fight relentlessly for every single day of his early reign, knowing one strategic loss meant annihilation. Imagine the sheer logistical terror. Armies needed in Egypt, while simultaneously the crucial trade routes of Elam were choked by insurrectionists claiming to be the long-lost son of the previous king. Darius moved with the cold, surgical precision of a master architect rebuilding a collapsing skyscraper while standing on the shifting foundation. His carefully selected generals were dispatched like lightning strikes, brutally crushing resistance. But Darius understood that brute force alone would not secure loyalty. He needed legitimacy that transcended mere military might. That legitimacy was carved high into the unforgiving Zagros Mountains, on the sheer cliff face of Behistun, an inscription so massive and so high that only the gods and those skilled royal masons working on terrifying ropes could truly witness its creation. This wasn't merely a record of his victories. It was a sacred, trilingual manifesto, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, declaring that Darius was the chosen instrument of Ahura Mazda, establishing the divine right of the new dynasty with terrifying finality. Every traveler on the main road was forced to gaze up at the sculpted relief of Darius, standing triumphant, crushing the 9 false usurpers beneath his mighty sandal. A psychological weapon more potent and enduring than 10,000 cavalrymen. It was the first time in history that a ruler weaponized history itself, rewriting the narrative of succession in stone, making defiance against Darius equivalent to defying the highest deity. With the internal fires finally smothered, Darius unleashed his true, terrifying genius, the revolutionary organization of the colossal empire. He recognized that size was meaningless without structure, and he proceeded to build the ultimate machine of governance,
turning a collection of conquered lands into the world's first true bureaucratic superpower. He formally divided the realm into approximately 20 heavily monitored provinces, the legendary satrapies, each governed by an appointed satrap, protector of the realm, who answered directly to the King of Kings, ensuring local control while maintaining ruthless central oversight.
But Darius built ingenious fail-safes. Each satrap was constantly watched by 3 independent entities: the military commander, who controlled the troops, the finance officer, who controlled the taxes, and most terrifyingly, the king's own secret inspector, the feared eye and ear of the king.
This intricate system of checks and balances ensured that no single governor could ever amass enough power to challenge the central authority, creating a stable, predictable taxation and governance structure that allowed the empire to breathe, trade, and prosper for centuries. To knit this impossibly vast organism together, Darius commissioned the infrastructure project that would define ancient efficiency and speed, the Royal Road. Stretching over 1,600 miles from the capital city of Susa all the way to Sardis near the Aegean Sea, this paved marvel was the central circulatory system of the empire. Utilizing carefully maintained rest stops, fortified caravanserais, and royal postal stations every few miles, the king's messengers, the legendary Angarioi, could cover the distance in a mere 7 days, a journey that might take a typical merchant 3 agonizing months. This ensured that royal decrees, military mobilization orders, and crucial intelligence reports could travel at the speed of command, making the sprawling Achaemenid territory feel terrifyingly small and unified under the king's immediate, decisive gaze.
Economic chaos, inherited from previous, less organized regimes, was also systematically eradicated through the introduction of the daric and the silver siglos, the empire's first widely accepted bimetallic currency.
This standardized, high-quality coinage simplified trade across immense distances, encouraging merchants from the Indus Valley to the Nile Delta to exchange goods under Persian guarantee, funding the entire immense apparatus of the state and filling the royal treasuries to bursting with gold from the world's furthest corners. With his house finally in order, his legitimacy established by divine mandate, and the treasuries overflowing, Darius turned his gaze outward once more, specifically toward the terrifying, unseen enemies lurking beyond the Black Sea, the Scythian Orse nomads who harassed the northern satrapies. These warriors were a constant, unsettling threat, masters of the bow and the strategic retreat, impossible to pin down, and Darius decided the only way to secure the north was to pursue them into their own desolate heartland. It was an expedition of staggering, unprecedented logistical complexity, involving the construction of a massive pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, a feat of engineering that dwarfed anything previous, and the deployment of an army estimated to be 70,000 strong, deep into what is now modern-day Ukraine. The campaign itself proved frustrating and brutal.
The Scythians refused pitched battle, employing a devastating scorched earth strategy that lured the vast Persian army deeper and deeper into the empty steppe, stretching supply lines to the absolute breaking point. Darius learned the painful lesson that even the most organized empire in the world could not conquer an enemy that was fundamentally nomadic and refused to fight on conventional terms, forcing a strategic, humiliating withdrawal, but not before stabilizing the critical Thracian coast and securing a crucial foothold right on Europe's doorstep. The stage was now set. The Persian machine was fully built, oiled and running perfectly, commanding nearly 50% of the world's population. The only thing left was to look further west, across the narrow straits, toward the tiny, quarrelsome city-states that dared to defy the King of Kings and burn his temples. Greece was about to feel the shadow of the Achaemenid Titan, and history was about to enter the most famous, most dramatic, and most misunderstood conflict of the ancient world. Darius the Great, the man who had tamed the Scythian wilderness and reorganized the known world, felt a heat that was not merely anger. It was the scorching shame of a god insulted by ants. Athens had dared to touch the royal city of Sardis, the jewel of Lydia, turning timber and marble into ash and smoke. This act of brazen defiance demanded more than just vengeance. It required the surgical removal of the entire cultural cancer known as Hellas. The great king did not move quickly. He moved with the terrifying, inevitable speed of geology. His decrees traveled the royal road, awakening provinces from Egypt to Bactria, demanding ships, horses, and 10,000 talents of gold to fund the coming storm. This was not merely a military campaign. It was a massive, terrifying mobilization designed to remind the world that, when Persia sneezed, the entire Aegean Sea was supposed to catch pneumonia, and now the king intended to give it a fatal plague. His first attempt at chastisement was launched in 492 BCE, commanded by his own son-in-law, the highly regarded Mardonius, whose mission was to secure the northern Aegean flank, swallowing Thrace and Macedon, forcing them back into the empire's loving iron grip. Mardonius succeeded in securing the land route, but the sea, that fickle, chaotic element that defied all Persian logic, rose up against him. The mighty fleet, the very backbone of the planned invasion, was shattered not by Greek triremes, but by the relentless, merciless tempests off the treacherous cape of Mount Athos. 300 ships, thousands of men, swallowed by the wine-dark sea, a monumental loss that crippled the first wave of the invasion before it even reached the Greek mainland. It was a logistical nightmare, a spiritual setback, a public humiliation for the King of Kings. But for Darius, merely a frustrating delay. He was eternal. His mission was inevitable, and he would not be deterred by wet ropes and sinking hulls. He retooled the plan, rejecting the coastal march and opting for the direct, brutal, and swift route, sailing straight across the Aegean heartland and bypassing the dangerous land approach entirely. He appointed 2 new, ruthless generals, Darius, a Median expert in siege warfare and naval strategy, and Artaphernes, a nephew of the king, entrusted with the sacred, solemn duty of delivering Athenian heads to Susa.
Their mission was meticulously simple. Sail directly to Attica, land near Athens, burn the city to the ground, and enslave the population as a horrific object lesson. The rest of Greece, Darius calculated, would then kneel without a fight, having witnessed the total annihilation of the rebels. The Persian armada. Estimates claim over 600 ships, carrying perhaps 50,000 to 60,000 fighting men. The finest cavalry the world had ever seen, the fearsome Sakas, the deadly Medes, the immortal core of the empire, began its terrifying island-hopping campaign, leaving a trail of terror in its wake. Eretria, a city on the island of Euboea that had also dared to aid the Ionian rebels, became the first target of this second, more focused, and infinitely more dangerous wave. The city was tragically betrayed from within by local oligarchs, its walls easily breached, and the ensuing slaughter was absolute, designed to send a clear, chilling message echoing across the narrow strait to the Attic Peninsula. The inhabitants were chained, their city leveled to the dust, and the horrifying example was so profound that a wave of paralyzing panic seized every free Greek state. The shadow of the King of Kings had finally reached the very edge of the mainland, and the air crackled with doom. Athens, watching its ally burn across the water, was gripped by a hysteria bordering on madness, yet still clung desperately to the only hope that mattered: the legendary, terrifying soldiers of Sparta who lived only for war. But Sparta was agonizingly slow. Bound by arcane, ancient religious festivals, the sacred Carnea, they refused, absolutely refused, to march until the full moon passed. They were offering prayers while the doom of Greece was sailing toward shore, a bureaucratic and theological delay that was a dagger to Athenian morale. The Athenians stood utterly alone, facing the largest empire the world had ever known, armed with nothing but their fragile pride, their radical democracy, and 10,000 hoplites, citizen soldiers, heavy infantry, farmers and potters, trained only to stand shoulder to shoulder in the phalanx formation. They sent their fastest runner, the legendary Phidippides, racing the 140 brutal miles to Sparta, begging for immediate aid. "Run, boy, run! The fate of all civilization rests upon your sandals," the city might as well have screamed. He returned with the crushing, devastating news: no, Sparta would wait for the moon. The Athenians, utterly isolated, had to make a horrific, binary choice: defend the city walls, which would invite a protracted siege and naval envelopment by the overwhelming Persian fleet, or meet the terrifying enemy on the open field, risking total annihilation but seizing the initiative.
The generals, led by the astute military genius Miltiades, persuaded the council that retreat meant slavery, and they marched out to the Bay of Marathon, a flat coastal plain perfect for deploying the lethal Persian cavalry, yet offering the Athenians a narrow geographical chance to block the path toward the interior mountains. Miltiades knew the sheer size of the Achaemenid army was terrifyingly overwhelming, but he also knew the crucial weakness of the Persian force: light armor, reliance on archery, and a fundamental lack of training for sustained, brutal shock combat against the disciplined Greek heavy infantry. The Athenians positioned themselves defensively, watching the endless, glittering mass of the Achaemenid army unload their horses and men onto the plain. The Persians waited, supremely confident, believing the Athenians would either surrender immediately or be routed by the first cavalry charge. Why rush? They had all the time in the world. Miltiades, defying every conventional tactic of his era, ordered his scant 10,000 hoplites to stretch their line thinly across the entire Persian front, strengthening the flanks while dangerously weakening the center to prevent the feared cavalry envelopment. This was a desperate, almost suicidal gamble, an act of sheer madness. The tension stretched into days, the silence before the storm absolute. Then the moment arrived. The Persian cavalry, their most feared asset, was either being reloaded onto the ships for a flanking maneuver toward the undefended city, or Datis finally signaled the advance. Miltiades saw his window of opportunity closing fast. He gave the order that echoed through history: "Charge!" The heavily armored Athenians did the unthinkable. They did not wait for the enemy to close. They ran toward the greatest army on earth, covering the final 200 yards at full sprint, transforming a disciplined formation into a terrifying, screaming, unstoppable human battering ram, ensuring the Persian archers could only get off one volley before impact. This was the exact moment history pivoted, the point where the silent titan of the East finally met the defiant, screaming heart of the West. The Battle of Marathon had begun, a collision that nobody, especially not the King of Kings, could have ever predicted.